Okay, so I do want to get us started pretty much on time so that there's lots of time for Q&A. Everybody seems to have a lot of questions, so that's great. My name is Natasha Tracy, and I am a writer, an author, a speaker, and a consultant. And I'm honored to be with you here today. Today, I'm here to talk about my experience as a person with bipolar disorder. I want to talk about getting treatment in what some might laughably call a rather imperfect system. I want to talk about what I've learned about medication adherence for me and about medication adherence for others. And I want to talk about the rights of people to be medicated or not medicated as they wish. So first off, I'm going to talk a little bit about myself and my own story. So if you were to ask my mother, she would tell you that I started manifesting really weird symptoms even when I was a child. It turned out these symptoms were a bipolar disorder. And by the time I was 12, they had come on full force. However, I didn't actually see a psychiatrist until I was 19 years old. Partly this is because I was raised in a family that didn't believe in psychiatry. I didn't believe in mental illness, and I most especially did not believe in depression, which is primarily what happened to me when I was 19. I felt that depression was just weakness. I thought it was anger turned inward. And I thought that psychiatrists were just drug pushers, and the drugs that they prescribed were just for people who couldn't handle the realities of life. I've come to learn that may have been somewhat incorrect. So at 19, I was studying for a degree, and I was severely depressed and suicidal. Out of desperation, I saw one of the counselors at the university. For some reason in my family, counselors were good and psychiatrists were bad. Not really sure how that works. And when I saw this counselor, I cried out my whole story to him about self-harm and suicidality and depression. And he looked at me and he said, "You need to see a doctor." My immediate response to this was absolutely not. I said, "I am not one of those weak people who need a psychiatrist." But the thing was, I had been in so much pain for so many months, I was prepared to try anything. So by the time I saw the psychiatrist, I actually already knew I had bipolar disorder. I had done tons of research, and while the depression was extremely pronounced, I could also see hypomanias as clear as day going backwards. There were times of me not sleeping, not eating, endless energy, talking inhumanely fast and in vast amounts, over-socialization, crazy ideas, and more. They were never a problem for me, and they were really short, but they definitely existed. But the psychiatrist disagreed, however. The psychiatrist pushed past my hypomanic experiences and diagnosed me with minor depression. But even though I knew he was wrong, I was so fatigued and tired from fighting the mental illness that I had nothing left to disagree with this authority figure. So when he said minor depression, I just said, okay. And yes, he prescribed me an antidepressant, as you would expect. And when they were sitting on my kitchen counter, the fear of this medication was palpable. I didn't want to be one of those drug addicts. I didn't want my consciousness changed by those drugs. But I was so desperate and in pain, I was willing to try anything, even though I didn't believe in it. I managed to choke down the medications and go to sleep, and I had nightmares the entire night long. And when I woke up the next morning, it felt like someone was standing on my head. I was dizzy, my head was hurting, my body ached, and my stomach was in knots. I had no idea that side effects could happen the very next day. My doctor certainly had never mentioned it, but turns out they can. But I took the medication as directed anyway. The only thing that the medication did was make me feel worse. That much I can say for sure. And so my doctor prescribed another medication, and another, and another. And this led to 18 months of medication trials, each one making me feel even worse than I already did. Luckily for me, after a year and a half, I got a new doctor. And the new doctor did agree with me I did indeed have bipolar disorder. And so we tried bipolar medications. Unfortunately, it didn't take long before we had tried them all, and I either couldn't tolerate them or they didn't work. So my psychiatrist did something that I didn't know psychiatrists could do. My psychiatrist gave up on me. I walked into his office, sat down in the chair, he looked at me, threw his hands in the air, and he said, "I can't help you, you're no longer my patient." I felt like I'd been cut in half. I was so sad and so sick and so suicidal. I had no idea what to do. And not surprisingly, things did not go well for me after that. I just got more suicidal, to the point where the counselor I had been seeing was scared for my life. And so he sat me down and he said, "Listen, if you want to survive, you need to go back to the psychiatrist." I had no idea how to process that information. Go back to the guy who had given up on me? How was I supposed to do that? But I did it. I saw no other option. It was death or a doctor, and I was still fighting death. And when I saw my psychiatrist, he, of course, had no idea what to do with me. And he said, "Why don't you try this?" And he handed me some drugs. And what he meant by this was a drug that didn't really have any proof behind it. What he meant by this was a random guess. So I took it. And his random guess was a miracle for me. It actually changed everything around. I suddenly realized what it was not to feel pain all the time. And I was still at university, and even though this drug was miraculous for me, it certainly didn't quell all my bipolar symptoms, and dialing in the dosage did take quite some time. But somehow, with its help, I managed to get my bachelor's of computer science and find a job in my field. And then things went well for a while. They went well until they didn't. Things went well until I felt the mudslide that is sinking into a new depression. My medication just stopped working. Now, this is really common in the treatment of bipolar disorder. Many people experience tolerance, and their medications stop working for them. And so people are forced to re-audition drugs to find something new that works. So I went back to my psychiatrist, and we tried a few more things. Nothing worked for me. And then I got a new job. And that was fine. The job was easy. The problem is that changing jobs is stressful, inherently. Ask anyone who's ever started a new job. And I didn't actually feel stressed. But it was like my brain was experiencing the stress and not telling me about it. Because what I found was that in a 6-month time period, I was so suicidal that I had to be hospitalized. I spent a couple of weeks in a sparse and bland room. I like to say that if you weren't depressed before you got to this room, you were depressed, you had to stay in that room. The hospital is not a carnival ride. But here's the thing. The hospital does something, and they do it better than anyone else. The hospital keeps you safe, and the hospital keeps you alive so that your treatment has a chance to work. And that was the perspective that I needed to have in order to stay there. I remember my first morning waking up at the hospital because a nurse was shaking me awake violently, yelling at me to go have breakfast. And I said to the nurse, "I can't see." The nurse either didn't hear me or she didn't care, because the last thing I remember was her walking out of my room yelling at me to go have breakfast in the common room. And when I stood up, I realized that if I looked straight down, I could see my toes. I didn't know why I could only see my toes, but I could see my toes. And so somehow that day, I managed to get to the common room and eat some toast while only looking at my toes. Of course, what had happened to me was that there were major side effects at play. Eventually, I realized that I was so drugged from the medication they had given me in the hospital that I physically couldn't open my eyelids. Of course, this did wear off throughout the day and eventually wore off altogether. And eventually, my doctor felt the medication had stabilized me enough that I could go. Now, these medications that I were on were not miraculous, but I did manage to limp through 3 years of work. And then through a series of very unusual events, I got scouted by another company. You might recognize their name. It was Microsoft. So Microsoft is not what I call a good environment for mental health. The people there are wickedly smart, the job is wickedly hard, and I swear to you, someone would actually stab you if they thought it would get them a better review come September. It was hard. And even though I tried my hardest, and even though I saw it coming, within 6 months, I had to take time off for disability. I was extremely ashamed, but I was also extremely suicidal, and I saw no other choice. The trouble was, at this point, I had been through every shade of pill, and nothing was working for me. So I decided to get a vagal nerve stimulator. It's just called a VNS. So what happens with a VNS is a computer is implanted in your chest, and then wires go from that computer up to your vagal nerve. Electrical impulses are generated by the computer, hit your vagal nerve, and then those electrical impulses go up to your brain, and the doctors hope this will have an antidepressant effect. If you look at the research, you'll see that this was truly a very desperate move on my part. Now, the device doesn't actually get turned on when they implant it. So a couple weeks later, I went to a specialist in VNS, and he took a fancy computer, he put it on my chest, and he said he was going to do a diagnostic, and then he turned the device on 5 times higher than it was supposed to be. He electrocuted me. Now, this is a pain that I cannot fully express to you. I was screaming at the top of my lungs, but you couldn't really hear it because my throat was closed from the electrical current, and I was choking because I couldn't breathe. After what felt like an eternity to me, the device did get turned off. And yes, the doctor did get it to the right setting. Unfortunately for me, even to this day, when it's correctly set, it still closes my throat to a smaller degree and causes pain when it goes off, so it doesn't work. That said, the time off work had allowed me to de-stress enough that I could go back, and that's what I really wanted. And unfortunately for me, after 3 years, there were 2 major rounds of layoffs at Microsoft. And of course, I was in round 2. And not really to anyone's surprise, my mental health declined greatly after that. And I was in a terrible spot because I had become acutely suicidal, but I had almost no treatment options left. Well, there was one. There was ECT, electroconvulsive therapy. I remember when I first read that ECT was still being offered and how barbaric I thought it was. And I swore to myself as a patient that I would rather die than undergo something like that. But there I was, actually facing death, and I knew I had to try it. Now, most people think of the famous scene from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest when they think of shock therapy. This is understandable. That scene is quite indelible for many people. But of course, modern-day ECT is nothing like that. In modern-day ECT, you are given a general anesthesia so that you don't feel the electrical current, and you are given a paralytic so that your body is paralyzed so that you don't seize and the muscles don't hurt you. And it is fairly simple, short procedure that many people do find life-changing. In my case, I remember waking up after the first treatment, and what I remember was the pain. My jaw hurt so much that I couldn't move it to tell the nurse that I was awake and needed pain medication. And looking down, I saw that I'd been locked to the gurney. That did not make the experience any better. And of course, no one had told me that any of this was going to happen. I actually had 9 ECT treatments, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, for 3 weeks. And then during the treatments, I started experiencing cognitive dysfunction. Many of you know what cognitive dysfunction is, but basically it's when your brain doesn't work properly. So for me, I would be on a road that I'd been on 1,000 times before, but it felt really foreign. I couldn't remember how to get to the grocery store, and I couldn't remember how certain things had ended up in my apartment. It was terrifying. And while doctors will tell you that this is generally normal and it will pass, what no doctor can do is guarantee that it will. And I needed my brain to work. I needed it to get a job. I couldn't afford for this fog and confusion to continue. So because the treatments hadn't been working and because I was experiencing cognitive dysfunction, I elected to stop treatments. Shortly thereafter, I was left with no money, no home, and a mental illness that was out of control, and a mess of stress due to the fact that I had to move back to Canada sort of against my will. I ended up living on my mother's couch for a couple of weeks, and then eventually I moved back to the city where my university was. And of course, part of what I needed was a new psychiatrist. And so the system decided that I needed to be interviewed by a psychiatrist to ensure that psychiatry was the right treatment for me. So I went in to this interview, and a woman came in and she sat down and she didn't even introduce herself to me. She just started firing questions. And they were the kind of questions that you wouldn't want to answer even if your best friend asked them, let alone if some stranger doctor lady asked them. And at the end of it, my face was puffy after a waterfall of tears, and she said to me, "You're not going to be a patient here." I said, "What? I have bipolar disorder. I need a doctor." And she said to me, "You've tried every treatment. What's the point in you having a doctor?" I had to beg her for a 15-day supply of medication, and then I left her office unable to stop crying. I could barely stop myself from running into traffic that day. And then I did something that people do sometimes. I went into denial. I said, "I'm great, everything's fine, I don't need a doctor." And what I like to say about denial is denial works really, really well for a really, really short period of time. And one day, after a couple of weeks of being in this denial, I came home and I just broke. I fell into a million pieces on the floor. I couldn't take it anymore. If I couldn't get a doctor, then I couldn't get help. And if I couldn't get help, then I couldn't get better. And if I couldn't get better, then what was the point? So I took some pills, drank some booze, broke a glass, and tried to slit my wrists with the broken glass. Turns out the glass wasn't sharp enough. I crawled around on my kitchen floor looking for a piece that was. I passed out doing that. When I came to, I realized something. I realized that I needed a doctor. I realized that that lady, she was wrong. I wasn't beyond help. So thanks to some personal assistance from my GP, my old psychiatrist agreed to see me again. And this was actually quite incredible because he wasn't even accepting patients at the time, and yet he agreed to see me anyways. And I have never been so thankful for a kindness in all my life. So when I went to my first appointment with my doctor, he said that he didn't really know what to do, but he said, "Take this little blue pill." And I said, "I've tried that little blue pill. It didn't work." And he said to me, "You haven't tried that little blue pill in combination with the other things that you're on." "Fine, I will take your little blue pill." And within a week, it was like the world had opened up again for me. Things were suddenly in color. I was feeling something other than pain and agony. Against all odds, the treatment had worked. and it had worked after 6 years of me searching for something. Now, I would like to tell you that it has remained that way until today, but that would be a lie. What I can honestly tell you is that I grew tolerant of that medication, and we're still auditioning new medications. But what I can say is that with the help of that new psychiatrist, I have never attempted suicide again. And I have more hope today than I did on many of my previous days. And now I'm a published author, one of the internet's leading authorities on bipolar disorder, and not because I have lived experience, but because I've actually been researching bipolar disorder for 15 years. I've also been published in a scientific journal. My life is still disabled by mental illness every single day, but it is not lost. The people who gave up on me were basically sentencing me to death. But I believe that none of us are beyond help and hope. Okay, so based on my little experience there and what I know, I want to talk a little bit about medication adherence. So, called medication adherence or medication compliance, what we're really talking about is people getting on and staying on a treatment plan, which typically means medication. And I hope from my story, you get the impression that staying on medication is actually not a very easy thing to do. When doctors give up on you, when the medications make you feel worse than you did before, and when many people can't even get a hold of their medications because of insurance issues, cost issues, incarceration, there are so many reasons why being medication adherent is so difficult. And to be honest, I had periods myself when I was medication non-adherent. When the medications are just making you feel so bad, it seems like a good idea not to take them. And even when I was medication adherent, I still had many moments when I just wanted to throw my medication out the window. And I went to a doctor's appointment once and I told him that. And he looked shocked. And he said to me, "But why?" He needs to attend my talk. And the thing is, most people with mental illness will become medication non-adherent at some point in their treatment, maybe at many points. Sometimes it will be by choice, and sometimes it won't be. But once you become non-adherent, it's not the easiest thing in the world to become adherent again. This is because you generally need to start on a tiny dose of the drug again, you need to titrate it up, and it's weeks before there's any useful effects felt. It's like a double whammy. You get kicked in the stomach while you're already down. But that's not all. According to Kessler et al., in a study in 2001, about 55% of people with mental illness don't take their medication because they don't think they're sick. This is known as anacognosia. And anacognosia is not denial. It's not what I was doing. It's not denial. What it is a neurological condition. And what this means is that we can actually see the difference in brains that have anacognosia and those that don't. And as you can see by my story, with doctors giving up on you, it's actually easy to fall into the belief that you're not sick. Not to mention the fact there is a whole lot of anti-psychiatry messaging out there, especially online, telling people that they aren't really sick and they don't need medication. The message is that if you hear voices or that you see things, you are special and therefore do not need care. And honestly, who doesn't want to believe that they're special? In my case, I didn't want to seek treatment because I didn't believe in mental illness. Not because of anacognosia, but because I just thought mental illness didn't exist, period. And many people think like this too, and often these thoughts are created again by anti-psychiatry groups. These type of groups would have you believe that mental illness does not exist and that medication treatment is actually poison. Some of them will run massive stories about how the government is doing it to people. Desperation is the only reason that I sought help, and it took years for me to do so. And I didn't even grapple with the kind of illness, typically psychotic, that makes people think they aren't sick. The concept of getting help for a mental illness is a really weird one. The brain is the part of us that is sick, and yet it is the brain that is responsible for making good decisions and reaching out for help. It's like the pancreas trying to cure the pancreas. It's not surprising that some sick brains can't comprehend that they are sick. It's not surprising that some brains think that the way that they work is normal. When it's all you've ever known, it is to some degree comfortable, and change is very scary. It is not surprising that some brains are in denial because no one wants to believe that they're sick. People go through stages of denial with any serious illness, but it's so much worse with mental illness because it is the brain that is sick. Most people don't even understand how this is possible. Most people can't understand how your brain could be giving you bad information. They can't understand how one's own brain could be untrustworthy. I get it. I used to be one of these people. When you've never had a mentally ill experience, it's hard to truly get it. And even though these are medical illnesses, there is a habit of believing that you can just think your way out of them. I have thought this many times myself. I have believed that if I just thought hard enough, I wouldn't have bipolar disorder anymore. Moreover, I think it is completely reasonable that people don't want to take drugs that make them feel so bad. If you ever question this, just get on an antipsychotic at a dose that is given to someone with schizophrenia, or get on lithium to a dose that's given to someone with bipolar disorder, and tell me how you feel. I have had everything from dizziness to unending headaches to intestinal problems to major weight gain to gross fatigue to the inability to stop sleeping to my hair falling out and many more side effects. And some of these I live with to this. It is a truism that for some people, medication side effects can be disabling, just like an illness can be. I'm not saying that the illness is better than treatment. I'm not saying that. Certainly, treatment is much better than the illness itself. Without treatment, I wouldn't be here today. I fully acknowledge that reality. But one should not discount how incredibly difficult it is to remain on medications with such adverse side effects. And one shouldn't forget that it can literally take years to find a medication that actually works. Ask yourself, could you go through 6 years? Could you even go through 2 years of medication change after medication change, with each one only making you feel terrible before you could find one that worked? Could you really do that? And do you really blame people who can't? And it's worth mentioning that many doctors don't seem to care about side effects. It seems that their perspective is that it is their job to get us on medication no matter what. And what we as people want, which is a fulfilling life with as little pain as possible, doesn't seem to enter into the equation. I went from a size 10 to a size 18, and a doctor never, ever mentioned it to me. They never changed a medication based on it. They never even recorded my weight in a chart. And believe me, that kind of weight gain is really common with a lot of the medications that we take. And then if you do gain that much weight, diabetes is right around the corner for you. In other words, you get another illness and you get to be sicker than when you started. Yet doctors don't seem to care about this or even notice in some cases. It feels like your mental health is their only concern, and whatever else happens to the rest of your body, that's somebody else's problem. And this breeds mistrust and acrimony between the patient and the doctor. I have on so many occasions been so frustrated with my doctors because they didn't seem to take me seriously or hear what I was trying to say. I have been incredibly frustrated with doctors who don't even talk about medication side effects when they prescribe something new. I have been so frustrated with doctors that don't ask me what the side effects are doing to me after I do start a new medication. In other words, I've been really frustrated. And the thing is, I'm lucky. I know it. I'm lucky because I have researched bipolar disorder and bipolar treatments for years. I'm lucky because I have the intellectual capacity to speak on a medical level. I'm lucky because I am not dealing with some of the cognitive dysfunction that many are grappling with. I have logic on my side. Not everyone can say that. And so when a doctor virtually throws a medication at you with no information and seemingly no care, it is completely understandable that a person wouldn't want to take it. You have to trust when someone prescribes something for you that they actually have your best interest at heart. And when is there time for trust? When when appointments are mere moments long and it feels like your doctor is treating you like a lab specimen. And this is not to suggest that there aren't many fine doctors out there. There certainly are. I like to think I have one now. But my point is that a doctor's quality ranges dramatically. And if your insurance only covers one doctor and you don't get along with him or her for whatever reason, what do you do? Do you give up on your mental illness treatment entirely? Maybe you do. And again, I am extremely lucky. I have seen some of the best doctors in Seattle and in Western Canada. How many people with a mental illness can actually say that? So there are so many reasons a person might be medication non-adherent. Anacognosia, as I mentioned, is a really, really big one and under-recognized by so many. Lack of access to doctors. As someone just before this session mentioned, waiting lists can be enormous to see someone that your insurance covers. Access to the medications because of cost, insurance issues, homelessness, or incarceration. And then there are the crippling medication side effects, a poor relationship between a patient and a doctor. There's fear of medication side effects and fear of being hospitalized against your will. And believe me when I tell you, people have a massive fear of these things. And then there's the fear of what will happen if other people find out you're taking psychiatric medication. Because believe me, when you get prescribed antipsychotics, boy, do you feel crazy. And it's not that you are. It's just that the word is so scary. The idea is so scary. And doctors don't take or have the time to sit you down and have a conversation about it. And then in the case of bipolar disorder, of course, some people choose to be medication non-adherent because they like some of the symptoms of their illness, such as mania or hypomania. In other words, there are almost innumerable reasons why a person might be medication non-adherent. I know to an outsider this seems illogical, but from inside, I can tell you that it isn't. Medication adherence is a huge challenge, even for someone like me, someone who understands the critical importance of this type of treatment. Trying to change the status quo for someone who has never known anything different, even if you promise that it will be better, is very difficult indeed. So I want to talk for a minute now about a person's right not to be treated, or a person's right to be treated. So I've come across this a lot of times, and it's often anti-psychiatry groups that would have you believe that anyone has the right at any time to refuse treatment for any reason. They call it human rights. And I must admit, I want my right to refuse treatment to be preserved myself. I don't think anyone is comfortable with rights being taken away and treatment being forced. I believe that in all possible cases, a person should be a partner in their treatment team. Not to mention the fact that if a person makes a conscious decision about their own treatment, they are more likely to actually stay on it. This is why I advocate patient participation as much as humanly possible. Now, family members contact me a lot about untreated loved ones. They desperately want to get their loved ones into treatment, but the people with mental illness, they just won't go or they won't stay on treatment. These are the siblings, children, parents, and other loved ones that are decompensating before their very eyes. These are with people before their very eyes, and the people with a mental illness simply won't get treatment. And I have very bad news for these people. Most of the time, there's nothing you can do. I know that it seems wrong to all of the people who are struggling to get treatment for someone they love, but it's actually a fact. Most people in this room know that unless a person is a danger to themselves or others, it is very, very difficult to get them forcibly admitted to a hospital. It perhaps is impossible. And in fact, even if the person is deemed a danger, there are many things that they can do in the hospital that can actually prevent treatment even from happening there. I tell every loved one not to be shy about dialing 911 should a dangerous situation arise. But beyond that, there's very little they can do. They can just talk to their loved one and try to reason with them. The fact is, the person isn't hurting anyone, and they can walk around psychotic, homeless, and eating out of garbage cans as much and as long as they want. And I think this is because in the United States, the rights of the individual is considered sacrosanct. But the thing is, when people were thinking about rights, when people were thinking about individual rights, they failed to take into account serious mental illness. No one ever took into account Anacognosia. No one ever considered that someone would actively choose to live on the streets rather than get medical help. And this is because most people have normal brains. Most people know that when you're sick, you see a doctor and you get treatment. Most people know that. Most people assume that other people have internalized that as well. People can't conceptualize of someone choosing to live on the streets rather than get medical help. I really don't blame the mentally well for not understanding this phenomenon. Their brains are too healthy, and empathy is hard when you have no experience to draw on. And some mental health advocates will tell you that a person has an absolute right to choose to be homeless. Some mental health advocates will parrot even anti-psychiatry rhetoric saying that forced or coerced treatment is a violation of a person's basic human rights. And I wish I could stand here and tell you that there were viable ways to get people treatment who needed it, that we understand and act on this need. But we just can't, and we just don't. In some states, there is something called assisted outpatient treatment. I imagine everyone's here familiar with it. It's AOT. Now, unfortunately, Oregon doesn't have this. So I'd like to think, you have it now? I'm sorry, my mistake. I was given bad information. You have it now, which is great. Obviously, advocates did a really good job to get that passed here, because that is not an easy thing. Well, okay, there's 2 steps. You have to have it before you can use it. So I'll take the wins where I can get them, but I hear what you're saying. It's very difficult. But outside of AOT, for example, the question is, When do the rights of society at large outweigh the desires of the individual? When is it really okay to force a person into treatment? Outside of that danger window, is there ever really a time? So I say that a person does have basic human rights. I say a person has rights around mental illness. But rather than saying that a person has a right to stay sick, I say a person has a right to live a full and happy life. Off the streets, not eating out of garbage cans. A person has the right not to be incarcerated and not to be sick. That's what I believe is a basic human right. I believe a basic human right is to a basic human life. But instead of understanding that, it is easier for often the majority to turn their backs on those they deem crazy, lost, and worthless. They assume people like me have no value. We have nothing to offer society. They assume that people on the street and in prison for petty crimes actively choose to be there. But who would choose that? Who would choose to be homeless or incarcerated? I can tell you who. People with sick brains. Now, my brain is sick, and I know it. It makes me believe things that aren't real. I know it makes me feel things that aren't real. And I know it pushes me to do things that I don't want to do. And I know these things intimately, which means that I'm aware that my brain is sick and can send out faulty thoughts. And so, because I understand this, I accept treatment, flawed though it may be. But imagine if you, yourself, suddenly found yourself believing with all your heart that the FBI was following you. Imagine if you suddenly believed that the trees could talk to you. Imagine if you held those beliefs so strongly that it was just like I am standing in front of you today. And then imagine if your brain were telling you that this was all happening because you were special. You weren't sick. You were a deity that other people just didn't understand. What if your brain spun a huge tale to convince you that what you believed really was reasonable? What if your brain told you that everyone else's view of the world was wrong, and when they confronted you, it was because they wanted to hurt you? What if your paranoia and anxiety amped up to the point where you would trust no one, let alone figures of authority? In this state, there is no way you would get help. There is no way you would turn to psychiatric treatment. Even if your beliefs ruined your life, those beliefs can be held so strongly that they overrule logic and everything else. I know it's hard to imagine that if you don't have a sick brain, but believe me when I tell you, most of you are only walking around well today because you happen to be lucky enough to have a well brain. You're lucky that you can't imagine what I just talked about. I can. It's terrifying. And the fact that I am not living a life on the streets right now comes down to luck. And what we have to understand is that people who do not have this luck are not lesser than us. And even though I am standing here sick but still logical and rational, I would say that I want my rights. I also believe that if I decompensated to the point where I couldn't comprehend my own situation, I would want someone to force me into effective treatment to get me back to a rational state. That actually terrifies me, but it's what I would honestly want. Because while patients should be a partner in their own wellness plan, they cannot do that if they do not appreciate what is really going on. You can't be a part of the treatment plan for cancer if you think you don't have cancer. So what can we do? What can any of us do to help people get treatment and stay in treatment? Well, first off, everyone in this room knows we have to make treatment easier to get. We just have to. We can't make a 72-hour psych hold the only interaction someone has with the psych system. The vast majority of people obviously need far more time than that to actually become stable, conscious, and rational. And we need to give them that time in a healthcare facility. I needed 2 weeks, and that was really a minimum. Doctors need to develop a better rapport with their patients and truly listen to what their patients want. As I said, there are some amazing doctors out there, and I certainly don't want to suggest that there aren't. But in many cases, doctors seem burned out and uncaring, even if they really do care. Keep in mind that if your one introduction to the psych system is a doctor that seems cold and uncaring, you are very unlikely to want to engage in that system ever again. Building a good rapport with a patient can actually save or lose a life. And we need better treatments. I know no one in this room has the power to cure bipolar or schizophrenia. And if you do, you better start working on it. I know that. But I also know that drug companies need to find better treatments to help those of us with mental illnesses. And I know that researchers need more dollars to look into these illnesses as well. Honestly, the treatments for some mental illnesses are horrible to withstand. If we can't do better by people with mental illness, how can we expect them to do better by us? And we need a court that takes mental illness into account and can sentence appropriately. I know some of you work in the legal system, and I have no doubt that you do the very best that you can to get help for the people you work with, but we still need to do better. We need a court that takes into consideration mental illness and doesn't sentence petty crimes driven by mental illness to incarceration, but rather suitable treatment. How can we justify spending all of the money that it takes to send someone to prison rather than spending that same money to actually have a person in a healthcare facility? And if they were in a healthcare facility, they would have a chance to get out of that system for good. Incarcerated, I don't think they have that chance. And yes, we do need forced treatment in some cases. Even though I am loath to admit it, and it honestly terrifies me, sometimes we need the power to medicate against someone's will because it is clear that they have decompensated to a level where they can't appreciate their illness or make rational choices around it. And we have to let doctors make these type of assessments. We can't tie everyone's hands and just chant human rights, human rights, human rights forever. And then lament our problems with prisons being full and doorways being used as beds. These are just 5 things that could help people with mental illness who refuse treatment. Some of them would help people with mental illness stay in treatment, and others would help them get treatment or even force them into treatment. And we need to work on these areas simultaneously. But until we get some of these things together, it's critical that those of us who can advocate for those of us who cannot. An advocate is invaluable in working through the healthcare system or even the prison system. Advocates are the ones who make the appointments, pick up the prescriptions, check and see if the person actually took their medication, and they are the ones who call in backup when they can. Without these people, many of us would not survive and certainly wouldn't thrive. So I've got some great resources on treatment adherence and helping people who don't believe that they're sick, and that will be available in the electronic handout after the conference. So I hope today I've given you a window into what it's like to be a person with a serious mental illness. I hope I've shed some light onto why people refuse treatment. I hope I've shown how poorly things can go even when you do everything right. And I hope I've opened up a conversation about human rights and the rights to be treated versus the right to wellness. In closing, I would like to reiterate something that I deeply, deeply believe. No one is beyond help, and no one is beyond hope. Thank you. Okay, so we do have time for Q&A. If anyone has a question about me, my thoughts, my personal story, why I wear such fabulous shoes, you are welcome to ask now. Sure. Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Okay, so thank you so much for your question and the comment on my hair. Um, so it's a little bit long, but what I'm going to summarize for the camera and say basically is a little bit more information about how community comes into play with recovery and not just medicine. I think I've got that pretty right. Okay, so you're right, I didn't talk about community, and partly that's my own bias because I don't use a mental illness community very much. Okay, that's my own personal bias. But that said, it's not that I have any issue with it or don't suggest it. I do suggest it. I suggest it very strongly. I believe that everyone should try support groups. I believe that everyone should connect with other people who are going through the same kind of life experiences, because that kind of connection is, one, something that will bond you, certainly, but also, two, something that is unique. You know, it's like I said, it truly is hard for people to understand what a bipolar brain is like. I get it. I don't necessarily understand what someone else's brain is like either. But if I am surrounded, at times at least, by other people with other types of brains, then I start to feel a little bit more normal. So I agree with you completely. Community is very important, and I do highly recommend it. Anything else? Yeah. Hmm? Yeah, so basically, you're asking about the competitive nature of society and it being crushing, not just for those with mental illness, but often many in society. Um, I think that you're right. A competitive nature can be a dangerous thing for many people, but I think that so I walked into Microsoft knowing what it was going to be like. I walked in with my eyes open. I knew it was going to be impossible, but I also knew that it was going to be great for my career, or at least I thought. And I knew that, okay? And so that competitive nature was something I knew I was walking into. But of course, some people aren't that lucky. Some people walk into Microsoft and think it's going to be, you know, kumbaya, which it's definitely not. Um, and I think, though, that what it takes is our own insight to know what environment we thrive in. Because some people thrive in competition. They do. I think, there are certain people, salespeople sometimes, who thrive in trying to get their sales numbers above someone else's sales numbers. And instead of crushing them, it motivates them. So I think what matters is not so much that those environments exist, but that the right people belong in the right environment. Yeah, so thank you. So that question was about changing the work culture around mental illness and taking time off, and what it's like with your coworkers if you have a mental illness and you have to take time off, and so on. So it's a funny thing. Microsoft has some of the most brilliant minds in North America working there. I can say that. They do. And so I was a little surprised that more of them weren't educated about mental illness. But it just goes to show you how little we do to educate people about mental illness in our society. It doesn't tend to happen in school. It doesn't tend to happen at home. So where the heck is it supposed to happen? To the best of my knowledge, people are not learning a lot of it on the streets. So yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that could really benefit a workplace, Microsoft or anyone, is a workplace education program about mental health. Because mental health costs companies massive amounts of money every single year, and I believe that some of that could be quelled with the right information. Now, sometimes people are always going to have to take time off, but sometimes one day off today prevents 1 week off in a month. And so, but people need to be educated and know that it's okay to take that 1 day off today. And yeah, that's a really tough thing when you're in a really competitive environment. One thing I will say is that, I did take time off. The company facilitated it quite easily. Now, the people around me may not have enjoyed it so much, but the company itself did facilitate it. And so companies are changing to some degree. Some of them are. So I can at least say that. At least the company did not fight me on that at all. That's amazing. Yeah, so thank you so much. So you were just saying how in the tech sector, some companies are definitely doing more to educate their workforce, which I think is amazing. And some tech companies, do have wads of cash more than I can imagine. So it's nice to hear that they're investing some of that in their employees' mental health. That's wonderful. Yeah, so your question is, how is it that you would convince a psychiatrist to change drugs when they are picking something that they feel that they have an incentive for, that it's the cheapest drug, whatever it is, right? So what I have found is very common is something I call psychiatrist amnesia, which is not amnesia by the psychiatrist, but amnesia by the people who sit in front of the psychiatrist, i.e. me. It's really hard when you sit in front of this authority figure that has so much power over you to remember everything you wanted to say that was really important to you like 20 minutes ago. It was really important, and now you can't even remember what it is. So I think what we need to do as patients is actually we need to write stuff down. I know that sounds like an incredibly simple solution, but it's actually something that works. Say you have 2 months in between appointments. You keep a diary. Every time you think of something, you write it down. Every single time. Then you get in front of your doctor in 2 months and you're able to say to him, yeah, so my concerns are this, my concerns are that, my concerns are the other thing. Because, getting to your question, what I think happens is that very few patients sort of lay down the law with their doctors. Very few patients are able to stand up to a doctor and say, I don't think you're doing the right thing here. Very few patients are able to do that. And it's not a patient's fault, but what we do need to do is stand up better for ourselves. And we can do this through having an advocate with us in the appointment. We can do this by writing things down. And we can do this basically by gaining our own kind of courage and our own kind of self-esteem to know what works for us and what doesn't work for us. And to say flat out to the doctor, antipsychotic X is not working for me. We need to try antipsychotic Y. I would like to do that now. That's it. Yeah, so your question is about addiction issues, whether I personally have had any, and how I feel addiction and mental health should be dealt with on the whole. So for me personally, I actually have a father who's an alcoholic. So I know addiction issues up close and personal. My brother is also a drug addict. So I know very, very well how these things work, how they're transmitted, how they're genetic, all that kind of stuff. So for me, I've always been extremely careful to not fall into that cycle because I know somewhere in my blood there's an addiction waiting to happen. There just is. So for me, I've always had extreme control over my behavior in that area to the point where it's never been an issue for me. But of course, not everyone is going to have that insight. Not everyone's going to know that about their parent. I mean, there's a whole host of reasons why that doesn't happen. So I personally have not been addicted to a substance. This is not to suggest that I have never self-medicated. Yes, I have self-medicated. It's not really a proud moment in my life, but yes, I have self-medicated. And I think that, again, that's a really normal thing given the amount of pain that people are in. And in terms of treating an addiction and mental health, gosh, it's a challenge, right? I think that if you do have a mental health issue and an addiction together, that they do both have to be dealt with. One doesn't work without the other. You know, I truly believe that one of the reasons my father did get dry at one point, but I believe that one of the reasons why he really, really didn't stay that way is because no one was addressing the fact that he was also bipolar. And so, you know, one just doesn't work without the other. It's like fixing one leg, but the other one's still broken. So I believe we need to treat them both. Now, it might have to be one at a time. Addiction may have to come first because detox may have to come first because simply for medical reasons, but they do have to both be dealt with at the same time. Yes, I think so. Yeah, so basically your question is surrounding wellness organizations who are perhaps more concerned about their numbers, I'm going to say, rather than the wellness of society as a whole. Does that sound about right to you? Yeah. Yeah, so I guess it's a bit of a paradox where what you're talking about is the people who can seek treatment are maybe the people who need it less. I think maybe that is, I mean, I'm not saying that on the whole, but to some extent that may be true because people who do need it the most are the people who need outreach rather than who will come to you. I do totally agree with that. Now, as for wellness organizations, I can't really comment on that. What I would comment on, however, is how campaigns, mental illness campaigns, mental health campaigns, mental recovery campaigns, focus on the non-serious mentally ill. And it's a very similar thing to what you're saying, which is that what everybody wants is a pretty smiling face saying, I was sick, but now I'm better. Um, everybody wants that, right? Everybody wants someone who, you know, had it really bad for some period of time and now they're a PhD and a professor somewhere. Like everybody wants that person, right? And those are who the campaigns are built around, are, you know, Joe Wonder over there. And it's the same basic thing, right? We don't want to focus on the fact that the people who really need our help, the people we need to be talking to, the people who we need to be reaching out to are the people you don't want to put on a poster. Those are real people. Those are the people we need to talk to and reach out to. And it's the same basic thing. Yeah. Okay. If you are happy, I am happy. There are a few business cards up front. I do have some copies of my book here. There are some more near the registration table. If you are interested, it's about bipolar and depression, of course. It contains coping skills as well as a sophisticated treatment algorithm to help people become a bigger partner in their own treatment team. Thank you.